Out in the mountains, far from anyone. My mother-in-law glared at me. "Take care now," she said coldly, before slamming the door of her fancy SUV. The sound echoed through the quiet night as gravel flew from the spinning tires. She drove off quickly, leaving me alone under the moonlight. For the first time, I caught a glimpse of her true self, her cruel smile and the sharp glint in her eyes. Predatory and triumphant. She looked at me as if she'd already won. "Why, Mom?" I whispered, my voice shaking. She leaned out of the window, laughing, a chilling sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Goodbye, Emily," she sneered. "No one's coming to help you. By tomorrow, you'll just be food for the wolves." Her words cut through me like ice. The roar of the engine faded, and the headlights disappeared into the dark, leaving me frozen in disbelief. Desperate, I reached for my phone, only to find it wouldn't turn on. Then it hit me, earlier. She had borrowed my charger. She had planned this all along. She had tricked me into coming here under the guise of showing me a stargazing spot. I felt so foolish. Maybe if I had tried harder to get along with her, or been more assertive about the growing tension with John, none of this would have happened. Now, standing alone in the freezing night, I realized how dire my situation was. The distant howls of animals echoed through the darkness, and fear crept into my heart. I could feel unseen eyes watching me from the shadows between the trees. The crunch of leaves and the sound of heavy footsteps grew louder. My heart pounded as I backed away, unsure where to run. My name is Emily Matthews. I'm 26 years old, and I've been married to John for 2 years. He's always been kind and supportive, the kind of man who would cook for me when I was overwhelmed or take care of me when I was unwell. Marrying him felt like the best decision of my life. I come from a well-off family but worked hard to build my own life. I kept my family's wealth a secret from John because I wanted to live independently, without relying on my parents' money. We both worked in the bridal industry, and I loved my job. But everything changed when John decided to quit his stable job to start his own business. Though I was worried, I supported him because I believed in his determination. Then, the truth unraveled. John had been in a relationship with another woman from his college days, something he had hidden from me. Worse, he had racked up $50,000 in debt from extravagant trips with her. I was devastated. To my horror, I discovered he had partnered with her to start his business. He claimed his family was supporting him financially. His mother, Susan, adored him and justified everything he did, treating me like I was trying to steal her precious son. Meanwhile, his sister Megan refused to work, saying she didn't want the hassle of having a boss. Megan's entitled and difficult attitude made dealing with her exhausting. For a while, I endured everything because I loved John, but Susan and Megan began visiting our home often, rummaging through my belongings without permission. They used my cherished possessions as props for their social media, treating them carelessly. One day, Susan took my favorite brown purse without asking and broke it. I hoped she would apologize, but instead, she smirked. "It was bought with John's money, so I don't owe you anything," she said dismissively. Her words crushed me. Even though I earned a good income, I couldn't keep replacing my things. I reminded her that the bag was something I bought before marriage, a dream purchase from my first big paycheck. "Yeah, right," she scoffed. "Girls like you don't have money for things like that. Don't try to fool me." To her, I was nothing more than a gold digger, someone who spent John's money on luxuries. She never tried to understand me. She only saw me as an enemy. When I turned to John for support, he barely listened. "Just hold on a little longer. Mom's going through a rough time," he said, brushing off my concerns. It hurt deeply to feel so ignored, even by him. I always thought of myself as strong and independent, but being so alone was overwhelming. Around that time, John's business started failing. He could no longer keep up with Susan and Megan's expensive lifestyles. When he finally told them he couldn't support them financially anymore, they panicked. But instead of considering getting jobs, they came up with another plan. "Take some of Emily's money and give it to us," Susan declared. "Family comes first." Susan and Megan's hatred reached its peak when they discovered my family's wealth. Their resentment morphed into obsession, driving them to concoct a sinister plan. Susan convinced herself that if I were out of the picture, they could take control of John's finances and inherit a fortune. She imagined millions, despite the fact that I hadn't written a will and my family, not them, would inherit everything. Her delusions led to an unfathomable scheme. Susan knew I loved photography, particularly capturing the night sky. She researched remote locations with minimal human activity, eventually finding a secluded spot that she deemed perfect for her horrifying plan. "Out here, no one will ever find you. It's bear season, this will look like an accident," she coldly informed Megan. Megan, without hesitation, agreed. "I'll drive for you, Mom. We're doing this for John," she said, pretending her motives were selfless, though it was clear they were driven purely by greed. On the day of their plan, Susan called me in an unusually friendly tone. "Emily, I know how much you love stargazing. There's a spot nearby with the most beautiful stars. Want to go?" she asked, hesitant but hopeful that they were finally warming up to me. I agreed. Their demeanor that day was uncharacteristically pleasant. They chatted about beauty and fashion, even complimenting my hair. "I've always wanted a daughter like you," Susan said warmly. It felt odd, but I wanted to believe their kindness was genuine. When we arrived at the remote location, they encouraged me to step out and start taking pictures. "We'll grab some things from the car and join you," they said. I stepped out, enchanted by the breathtaking night sky. Then, I heard the car doors slam. Turning around, I saw them locking the doors and starting the engine. "We'll be taking the house and car. Watch out for bears." "Honey," Susan shouted as they sped off, leaving me stranded in the freezing, desolate mountains. Fear gripped me as I realized I had been abandoned. But what they didn't know was that I wasn't entirely unprepared. I had a backup plan. Meanwhile, Susan and Megan were celebrating. "It's all taken care of," Susan gloated, grinning as they indulged in a fancy dinner, certain their problems were over. But when they returned home, their celebration turned to horror. Police cars were waiting in the driveway, and standing beside them was me, calm and unharmed, flanked by my father and several officers. How are you here?" Susan stammered, her face pale with disbelief. Megan tried to slip away, but the police stopped her. My father's safety precautions had saved me. Since I was young, he had insisted on tracking my location via GPS and having an emergency system in place. When I realized something was wrong, I activated it. My father, who had access to a private jet, reached me quickly. The remote location's clear terrain made it easy for them to land and rescue me. But that wasn't all. My father had also advised me to record suspicious situations. I had recorded the entire car ride, including Susan's chilling words, "We'll be taking the house and car. Watch out for bears." The evidence was undeniable. Susan and Megan were arrested on the spot for attempted murder and fraud. Susan fainted from the shock, while Megan broke down, hysterically blaming her mother. The story became a media sensation, with headlines mocking Susan as the mother-in-law who wanted millions. Details of how she and Megan used my belongings for social media clout went viral. John, who had once prided himself on his reputation, became a public disgrace. It was revealed during the investigation that John had been with his mistress since the very beginning of our marriage. He even testified against his family to save himself. But it was another betrayal in a long line of heartbreaks. The fallout was swift and brutal. Susan and Megan's bank accounts were frozen, their assets seized. Without John's income, they couldn't afford anything. Meanwhile, News of John's infidelity and financial recklessness spread across the internet, leaving him jobless and ostracized. Looking back, I couldn't help but question everything. Why had John married me if he never truly loved me? The kind gestures he once showed now felt like a cruel joke, but as painful as it was, I realized I was free from John, from his toxic family, and from the burden of pretending everything was okay. It was time to rebuild my life, stronger and wiser than before. My heart ached with pain and betrayal, but I resolved to move forward. Susan and Megan were evicted from their luxurious apartment and forced to move into public housing. Before long, their new location was leaked online. Susan became mentally unstable, muttering constantly about how her life was ruined. Megan, abandoned even by her own family, tried to work part-time jobs but struggled due to her lack of skills and work ethic. In a desperate attempt to reconnect, Megan messaged me, asking for help. Working at weddings and wearing nice clothes sounds fun, she said, referring to my job in the bridal industry. I ignored her. Success in the industry wasn't something she could simply jump into, and their downfall was not my responsibility. Susan, now living in a run-down apartment surrounded by graffiti and decay, spiraled further into despair. Meanwhile, I left the house I had once shared with John, along with all my possessions, and returned to my parents' home. It felt safer there, though I still carried emotional scars. One day, John unexpectedly called me. Seeing his name on the screen made my stomach churn. "Emily, I'm so sorry," he began. "I've cut ties with my mom. Please, let's try again." But his promises felt hollow. How could I trust him after everything? "Maybe your mistress needs your protection more than I do," I replied coldly before ending the call. Susan wasn't done yet. Desperate and bitter, she hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on me. When the detective found nothing, she latched onto a minor detail, my PTSD. Susan thought she could use it against me. One evening, as I walked alone, Susan appeared on the sidewalk. Her clothes were shabby, but her face wore a twisted grin. "Guess the bears didn't get you," she sneered. Her words sent a wave of fear through me, memories of that night in the mountains flooding back. She even made vague threats about spreading a non-existent video unless I paid her. Though her threat made no sense, her presence terrified me. She climbed into a car and drove off, leaving me shaken. I called my father immediately, and he was furious. Using his resources, he uncovered evidence of tax evasion and fraud within John's business. When confronted, John had no choice but to admit his guilt. His mistress, Lena, was horrified to discover she was implicated in his shady dealings. Their lies unraveled completely, leaving them exposed and humiliated. John's accounts were frozen, and he lost everything. Even Susan, the mother who had schemed so much for her own gain, abandoned him. "You're no son of mine," she declared, walking away from him. Both Susan and John were left with nothing, their selfishness having brought about their downfall. Despite it all, I chose to focus on healing and finding new purpose in life. My experience inspired me to help others escape toxic families and rebuild their lives. With my parents' support, I opened a refuge center at the retreat where I'd once been rescued. It became a safe haven for those seeking a fresh start. I even earned a counseling qualification to guide others through their pain. Over time, the refuge grew, welcoming people in need of hope and healing. One day, a woman arrived, escaping her abusive family. "You've done so well to get out," I reassured her. "I'm glad I left when I did too." Her tears softened into a smile as I reminded her it was okay to acknowledge her pain and set boundaries. With time, I began to smile again as well, finding joy in helping others rebuild their lives. Susan, Megan, and John continued to struggle, but I felt no pity. They were simply reaping the consequences of their actions. Meanwhile, the refuge blossomed into a place of hope and renewal, ensuring no one else would have to endure the kind of pain I once faced.